Good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress and to the Kluge Center. I'm Dan Torello. I lead chair programs at the Kluge Center, and we're all thrilled that you're here with us today for our event. Our title this afternoon is Representation Gone Viral, Digital Demand and Congressional Capacity. And it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Annalise Russell, who will be both speaking and moderating the panel. Dr. Russell was an Article I Fellow at the John W. Kluge Center. She was here last summer. And she is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of Kentucky. She is an expert at analyzing how organizations and lawmakers tell their story in a digital space. While she was at the Library of Congress, she was researching the history and current practices of digital politics in Congress. Her book, Tweeting is Leading, what a great title, is out with Oxford University Press. And in addition to her scholarly publications, she has a great degree of experience with journalism. She's published with outlets including the National Journal, Congressional Quarterly, and the San Francisco Chronicle. So Annalise, thank you for being back with us. And we're also grateful to Matthew Lira, Steve Dwyer, and Sam Carter, who are on the panel. And Annalise will be introducing all of them. So thank you, and over to you.
I'm short, and I'm not going to stand behind the podium because I'm short. Very rarely do I feel like I get the opportunity and people willingly let me talk about digital communication in Congress. So this is a real treat for me. Thanks again to our panelists, who I'll introduce here in just a bit. But I figured I'd go ahead and give you some background on this project, why it means so much to me, and also what happens when you decide to interview like 200 some odd folks in and around Congress to get a sense of what they think about communication and media. So unlike a lot of my academic colleagues, I came to the study of Congress with the radical notion that communication was cool. And as you can imagine, it was a somewhat chilly response. But I learned about Congress based on what a press staffer told me. Everything I knew about Congress was mostly what a press staffer told me. This should be your clue that journalism may not have been my calling. But based on that and a persistence and interest, I continued on with this notion that digital communication meant something and not just for campaigning. So I turned that into a book project looking at how members of the Senate use Twitter and talking about the fact that if you just read Twitter, you can learn so much about the Senate, and that digital can be very revealing beyond the literal sense. But there's a lot that we can take from that, right? We can learn about the fact that those who are campaigning for office or who might want to be president one day communicate very differently. Those who are in frontline districts communicate very differently. And at the end of the day, the president is always a really good digital punching bag. But beyond that, after reading, I don't know, like every one of Chuck Grassley's tweets about the 99 counties of Iowa, yes, I read them for 2 years, every single one. But you start to learn that there's only so much you can glean from the actual digital content that people are sharing. And so you have to ask some questions about what's going on behind the scenes. For a while, at least a lot of people in my field equated the words Twitter with digital, and that was the end of it. So I began this project to understand digital more broadly and sort of where does Twitter fit in? How does an office organize itself? And what is the daily deluge of a digital or a communication staffer? And I had the great foresight to start this project 3 weeks before the COVID pandemic. That's the best time when you really want to have conversations with people. But it turns out, I don't recommend it, but if you are going to do that, I recommend you do it with the only population of people in Congress that do know how to work a Zoom link. So it continued on, but now 3 years later, what I end up having is this really rich oral history of communication and digital in Congress. Sort of how did we get here? What does it look like today? And what does it mean for how the institution functions? And so Thinking about that more broadly, you learn some things and convince people to actually talk to you. After they realize that you have no interest in their politics, you just want to know what their approval chain is like, they tend to be a bit more forthcoming. And it turns into more like digital therapy sessions. What do you think of your job? How do you feel about your job? What is work-life balance for you? And spoiler alert, everyone is tired, no one gets enough sleep, and we're all still trying to figure it out. But I figure a couple takeaways from that project thus far that I figure are worth thinking about, and they're both not very specific, they're both very simple, yet the nuance of them is still very complicated. And one, it's that digital pain is a bipartisan problem, and communication is not cheap, right? These are very simple concepts. It's not surprising, but in reality, it doesn't necessarily play out that way. So when I say that digital is a bipartisan pain point, I don't mean that it's flowers and roses and that we should all come together and sort of kumbaya. No. Play the game, win prizes. Things are different across the aisle. But what I do mean is that the highs and lows of doing comms are experienced across the political spectrum, right? Getting your content stalled in an approvals chain that never ends, or getting asked to offer a response in the middle of your friend's wedding, or trying to do 50 tasks with just a hope and a prayer, right? Hallway gaffes happen, and most people don't look forward to having to clarify what their boss said, or sitting there watching your video render for a couple hours, hoping and praying it's not gonna die. And so all of these things, traditionally make the life of a comms and digital staffer harder, but there are also highs, right? Seeing your graphics show up on CNN, right? Having someone use your digital content in a way that's meaningful, working on a committee, having someone actually use the toolkit that you put together, right? Like, mind-blowing. So there are those highs, right? But to understand like how to trade those highs for the lows, right? There has to be a conversation about, what makes your job easier, what makes it harder, and how do we operate in an increasingly digital climate. The second takeaway when you have this many conversations is that communication, particularly digital communication, is not cheap. Particularly in my field, the word that often gets associated with digital and Twitter is that it's costless. And I understand the logic, but barring the very faulty premise, the notion that you can be a creative director with just an iPhone and a willing intern is both laughable and also deeply problematic. Because I think, and I would imagine some of our panelists would agree, we're no longer having the same conversation about whether communication matters. That's a conversation that we've been having for a while. But the question then becomes, how do you invest in it? And what should you expect from that investment? How much should it cost? And how much can you realistically expect from what you're going to do? Not everyone can be AOC, right? And not everyone should, right? There's a reason not everyone is doing TikTok dances. But there is a question about how do you invest in that and how much you should expect from it. And we have these conversations often about modernization and congressional capacity. How does the institution invest in itself? And oftentimes communication and digital communication aren't part of that conversation. But my goal with a lot of this work is to bring that into the conversation, because if you increase capacity for things like lawmaking, you also have to increase capacity for the people that are in charge of the way information flows within the institution, right? So it's not a specific problem, but it's one that applies to everyone, and communication is just as important, I think, part of that conversation as we begin to have them in the future and beyond. So with that being said, I'd love to take a second to introduce our panelists. I'm going to pull out my iPad because I don't want to get it wrong, since I already have today. But if you ever get the opportunity to put together a panel of people that you would really, really like to have dinner with, or that you really admire, I got lucky and got to do that. And so today we're joined by Steve Dwyer, who's currently the Senior Director for Innovation at the U.S. House of Representatives, Office of the Chief Administrator, working closely with digital services to support modernization and digital tools. Previously worked in a leadership office for 20 years. hires focused on technology, telecommunications, and digital tools for Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. Matt Lira is a former special assistant at the White House Office of American Innovation prior to his time at the White House. He spent over a decade in the Capitol serving as a senior advisor to then House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy and former House Majority Leader Eric Cantor. And the real hero today is Sam Carter, who filling in for Kerry Adams, who, well, on brand COVID got today. And so, but again, coming through for us is the Director of Communications and Marketing for the Office of the Chief Administrative Officer, managing a team to create content for House staff, members, and visitors to the U.S. House. And prior to CAO, she was Digital Director in the Senate and Deputy Communications Director and Digital Director for the House Budget Committee Majority. So thank you all for joining us. I am going to sit down now. Hopefully we can have a conversation about sort of what they've experienced in digital communication and what they see as a future or what things look like from their perspective these days. So the first question I have, I think, is kind of broad and backwards looking, but if you could say sort of one or two key moments that have shaped the digital direction that you've experienced in Congress. Matt, will you go first?
Sure. Well, thank you for pulling the panel together and to the library for allowing us to use the facility. It's wonderful to be here. I came in just under the wire. I was maybe like some of you, there's some traffic disruptions getting from the West End to the Hill, so I'm glad I made it. It was great to be here. To get to your immediate question, for me, I think of two specific moments. The first is there was an era where just having what I call presence was a struggle. So like there were literal efforts to get members to open Twitter accounts or to be on Facebook, and it was just like establish presence on these forums. Frankly, at a time when they had potential, they didn't yet have the reach that they have today in terms of the constituencies they represent. So. As members and staff were establishing that presence, the constituencies themselves were becoming more and more, it was becoming more and more a part of their daily life. And so I've established that as sort of one era. And the second era I think of I define as purpose, and sort of internalizing what the purpose of the platform is into the daily operations of Congress itself. And that is the phase we are in now, and I see some familiar faces around the room, and the work that many of you and others are doing to establish that purpose. So we're not just on Twitter, but we're leveraging it in a way that makes congressional life more effective, enriches the policy outcomes of the legislative process, and at least attempts to strengthen the connection between not only a specific representative, but the institution as a whole and the American people. And so I can go a little bit deeper if you'd like, but those two eras I think are the real, to me, how I think of the evolution of digital media on the Hill.
Steve, do you want to go next, and then we'll let Sam talk about more recent phenomena?
Sure, happy to. Thanks again, Annalise. Happy to be here. And I look back, I'm going to totally date myself since I got gray hairs here, and I've been on the Hill for a long time. Like a very specific moment was maybe a little bit before Matt came. It was when I remember there was a real effort for the first social network that I saw on the Hill, which was YouTube. So it was before Facebook and Twitter existed. And I remember there was just a real hard work from us that were working there at the time in leadership. A lot of it was Karina Newton, Pelosi's former staffer for a long time, where we're told we weren't allowed to use YouTube because there were ads on it, and there were a few other reasons. I don't remember the exact specifics. But a lot of us staffers banded together, both sides of the aisle, and we made the case that no, this is actually a cheaper alternative for just posting our videos, and there's lots of great interactions with the users and comments, and so we got that approval. It wasn't hard, it wasn't easy, and it took like over a year, but it was perfect because then with only a year or two later, suddenly you get Facebook and you get Twitter, and everything sort of just blows up. So that was a major early moment, and then I'd say another one is maybe I'd put it right around shortly after the 2016 presidential election, where prior to that, the social media companies were held in really high esteem. And working in digital was just the coolest thing, and it was always growing and getting more and more important, and more people interested in it. But then that dark cloud sort of came in, and it's gotten sort of darker, unfortunately. I still think that they're critical tools that every member of Congress needs to use and everything, but it's just been weird and different, and that's happened in a lot of ways. Like pre-16, we used to use the APIs all the time. They were wide open. You could pull lots of data from these social networks and use them in different interesting ways. They've just been gradually more and more locked down ever since then. They're very hard to use. So that's a more recent sort of sadder moment in social media.
Yeah, I think for me, again, this might be a more, as you said, more painful recent memory. I think, when it was announced that we were going to be moving into a 100% remote posture, digital directors came together in a way that I think offices didn't expect, where there was all of a sudden this need now to continue the business of Congress in a 100% virtual way, and nobody had any idea how to do it. How do you conduct a hearing in a way that follows the rules of the House? How do you conduct a markup in a way that follows the rules of the House? And you had digital directors who maybe potentially based on their tenure or whatever position they were within their committees, were just seen as the person who was sending out tweets. And all of a sudden, they're now the expert on here are the rules as they're written, here's how and they created the infrastructure truly of how we could continue the business of Congress. And they, like I said, I think that was an evolution in understanding the role that digital has on the Hill, even outside of the traditional communication sense, because you had groups of people who understood intricately how to use these tools, how to make sure that we, again, were protecting the privacy of members, maintaining the integrity of the institution, but most importantly, again, continuing the business of Congress. And so I think even coming out of that, understanding that digital folks have, as you said, a variety of skill sets, and oftentimes it's difficult because of budgets or whatever the case might be. They can be pigeonholed as doing one thing. But in that moment in particular, I think you just saw that just the vast knowledge that digital folks had and just how irreplaceable they were in keeping Congress going.
And each of you described something that sort of mirrors this difference between sort of what the institution knows or what the institution allows and what sort of technological capacity there is, and sort of how those two things meet together. We're seeing this with things like AI. How should we think about the relationship between sort of what the institution needs to do, what the institution allows, and sort of what the possibility of technology is? And then sort of related to that, are there pitfalls that we should think about or avoid as we sort of move forward?
I would say certainly on AI, it's something that is already really, being used a lot within Congress, and it's super powerful. It's changing the way everyone works in different ways, and I think, there are certainly pitfalls that we have to be aware of. And I know us at the CAO, we're studying carefully and trying to be cautious, and but we also have to reflect the fact that these tools are being used, and they are very useful, and they can be used safely, and we just gotta make sure that happens. But it's certainly, in terms of social media, and communications generally with constituents, we're just seeing more and more of these communications, and I think the ease of which to write formal communications with these LLM tools is really powerful.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we are in the business of constituent service. Even working within, outside of a member office, we should always be focused on how can we ensure that we are empowering members, staff, whoever, to be of service to the American people. And understanding those tools, I think, takes time to understand all of, as you said, the potential pitfalls. But at the end of the day, as you said, the onus on member offices to be more responsive, more agile, is just growing. So it's understanding, yes, the potential risk of tools, but again, at the end of the day, how can we be of service in the best way possible to the American people?
Yeah, building on that, I think that one of the unique things, particularly about the House of Representatives, is that it's for an organization that is as high profile as it is, and that is as large of an institution in terms of its national, in some cases global reach. It's remarkably entrepreneurial in terms of its day-to-day operations. And so there's the institutional officers who provide resources and capabilities across the entire body. But as we all know, there's a lot of experimentation that occurs within member offices. And this creates both opportunities and risks. A traditional agency CIO or a large corporate CIO or university CIO wouldn't tolerate some of the experimentation that is permitted inside of Congress because each House member is a constitutional officer, so they carry with them a certain degree of authority. So you get to see in the House, and this has been true, as far as I can tell, going back at least decades, if not since the beginning, where you just see this operational experimentation. People were experimenting with television in the late 40s and 50s before Congress embraced television. And we, of course, saw that with social, and we're seeing it now with AI. The obvious risks that creates, I think the most notable, it's always of concern to me, is a cyber security risk and making sure that the information flow is protected. And there's a lot of incredible professionals that are doing that every day, so that there's no systemic risk of any issues. But generally speaking, Congress needs these tools. So many of the friction points that inhibit the ability of Congress to serve their constituencies are those that can be solved with technology. So to take one of my favorites, legislative correspondence is an area where the number of constituents keeps going up, the number of staff, if anything, has gone flat, maybe even a little down over the last 20 or 30 years. And so therefore, the inbound communication, digitally enabled communication, has been a struggle. But with technology, you have the ability to not only respond to that information, but to process it substantively so that it can actually inform policymaking to a greater degree. So these are examples of where I'm really optimistic that whether it's generative AI or otherwise, is going to really help force multiply the capabilities of an individual member office.
And I would just add, one of the pitfalls that really comes to mind is the deep fakes issue, which I don't know if there's a good solution to that, but it's certainly scary how impressive AI can create those fakes, and that's a danger for politicians and people that are in the interest of the truth. So.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt on that, but just I think it's going to be incumbent on institutions, particularly government institutions, to leverage their credibility to establish authenticity on certain forms of content. And there are various approaches that can be done with technology, but to know, one of the benefits of C-SPAN, during the cable news era there has been an authoritative source for, okay, what's happening in the House today. You can read about it. You can get a newsletter from your member, or you can read a local paper, or if you're so inclined, you can literally just go watch it. And that authenticity, I think, is a key calling. And as you get into the area of deepfakes and other, just even non-malicious uses of generative AI, the ability to establish this is actually an authentic piece of content that is from the United States Congress will be increasingly important.
Is there a trade-off that you have to worry about with the capability to do more and to be able to manage that overflow, but then a crutch that it becomes saying, okay, well, maybe I don't actually have to invest the staff or human capital to do this. I can do this with technology. Is there a risk of sort of falling back on, well, technology will solve this for us?
Well, I think that falls back to understanding the breadth of the tools that you use. As you said, I mean, the volume or the number of constituents is growing, and as you said, staff are staying largely the same. Yeah. But there's still the expectation to be timely, to be responsive, and so I think it's just understanding the balance between meeting the volume while also understanding, especially again in the House of Representatives, the connection with the district. And you're always going to need people to make that connection and to deeply understand that. And you want to make sure whoever is the decider on how these tools are implemented understands the need still to have individuals who, again, as you said, are fact-checking and making sure that whatever is produced by any tool still speaks to the authenticity of who the member is and what they're hoping to achieve.
Yeah, and I'd say congressional staff, for all those years that I was a congressional staff working directly with a member, and of course he was leadership, but there's so much to do. There's never, and I mean, that's why you work nights and weekends, is because there's just never ending, but that doesn't mean you're getting everything done. So I'm not worried about that. Like I am more worried about, flatlining budgets and everything that in congressional capacity. I think, AI is a great example of hopefully something that's going to help a lot on that, but it's not like that we therefore are going to need less staff. I think they're just going to be able to do a lot more meaningful work and less mundane work.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of being a former is I can just say what I think all the time. And so I couldn't agree more. I think that Congress has done itself a disservice, sometimes a well-intentioned disservice of underinvesting in its human capital. There have been some great efforts. I don't want to knock the efforts that have been undertaken, but when you think about the average just executive branch agency, they have massive personnel advantage just in terms of raw numbers before you even get into issues around pay equity and things like that. So Congress would be wise, I think, to increase its investment in that area. Ironically, I think even for small government conservatives, it would be a mechanism to help them achieve that. If you're, of course, a progressive, it would help for other aims. But it's been, I think, a mistake of the institution writ large. And only other point there on technology, it's fun to see the maturity arc of technology adoption as it goes from like experiment by like a digital staffer in an office to maybe a conference or caucus-wide initiative to the point where it has earned a place to be sort of an enterprise across the whole institution with like the CAO or this, the clerk or others. And I know that you and your team and your boss and others are really focused on that. And I think that will relieve some burden too, in terms of the budget.
So in addition to things like AI uncertainty, there's also the uncertainty surrounding platforms like Twitter, Threads, what's coming. I can't imagine being a digital staffer the last 6 months and trying to figure out who is my audience and where are they and where are they going. And so I'm not asking you necessarily to predict what's coming with Threads, but do you have advice or wisdom for folks navigating those waters and trying to figure out how to think about audiences and the shifting platforms that may be coming our way?
I would say it's changing a lot, and it's interesting to watch. I'll say that. I think that, if you look at Twitter, which is now X, it's just a very, very different than it was a year or two ago. Even Facebook is so different than even like 4 or 5 years ago. They're both still important, but I think it's just far more important for digital staff to cast a wider net. You used to be able to check the box with just those two, and you got a lot new platforms that have large audiences. We were always of the philosophy of you got to go where the people are. So whatever those networks are, you got to, maybe that's Twitch lately or, Discord or whatever all these new sites are. And there's a whole lot of them. So I think it's a lot more work to do in this new environment.
Yeah, I think the thing that always stands out or that people catch on to very quickly, even if it's subconscious, is the adaptability of members who clearly understand the platform. Because there's nothing that's more apparent than when somebody is parroting to it. You can tell when something was written and it clearly wasn't the member. I think about all those Taylor Swift tweets. While I love them, at some point I was like, okay, we gotta cut it off. But I think it's just this is also the importance of understanding your member, and again, as Steve said, understanding where the people are and being able to explain that to your member in a way that is very succinct and clear. Because at the end of the day, you're also oftentimes, especially when you're navigating all these different platforms and trying to explain something different, they might be thinking about the rules that were set up 10 years ago. And they're like, well, this is how we've always done it. And so it's also having that understanding and that relationship too to explain it. So again, you always are authentic to who your member is, and they understand that going viral is not necessarily the goal. The goal is to make sure you're reaching constituents and going, as Steve said, where the people are.
So sort of related to that is the goal isn't always to go viral, but we don't really have a good sense of what it means to be an effective communicator. We have easier measures of what it means to be an effective lawmaker, right? We can look at policy outputs, but communication outputs are a little bit more tricky. There's no pass-fail necessarily, and so how should we think about what it means to be an effective communicator for principals in Congress?
Well, I'll maybe go first. I think to be an effective communicator is to be an effective listener, kind of counterintuitively. And so we often focus on reach as the metric, particularly in digital, as the metric for if something has been successful or not. And obviously reach is important, not just the volume, but the focus, like if it's constituents or what have you. But I actually think that like every new era of communication is defined by what makes that era distinct from its predecessors. So like JFK wearing makeup matters because television is a visual medium, and so on. FDR talking in a conversational tone versus sort of the loud, boisterous speeches of William Jennings Bryan matters because of the microphone. So when I think of what makes this digital era unique, it's the capacity to listen at scale, not necessarily the capacity to speak at scale, which is important, but it's no different than television in that regard. And so a way to know if a communication cycle is being effective is the amount of, the amount of engagement that has been achieved. That's in two-way with the target audience, which is a very difficult thing to do. But those are the metrics that I always obsessed over, and I think those are the ones that are the most important.
One thing I often thought of a job of a digital staffer is to make the boss's message like as accessible as possible to the average person on the platform, and that varies by platform. You know, I used to always say like Twitter is much more inside the beltway. You can be more policy heavy. You can be more technical, complicated. But then Facebook is much more ordinary people usually, and you got to speak differently, and you can still say the different message, but you can say it in different ways. So I think a lot of that is digital staff have to interpret that, and a lot of a digital staffer's day-to-day life is arguing with policy staff on how specific you need to be or want to be or not, and how accessible your language should be.
Yeah. And to your point, I think that's always going to be a challenge for digital staff. It's always finding that compromise between the legislative folks who have a very clear goal in mind, understandably, and are very protective of their language, and you as a digital staffer having the expertise to understand what, as you say, the average person, how they're going to understand this. And that takes time to build those relationships, and again, to see how the engagement is in terms of messaging. But for me, seeing the harmony, so for example, when we were working on the American Rescue Plan, that was something that seeing the harmony between our digital side and then our traditional comm side and getting our messaging consistent right off the bat, that was really, really important for us in terms of messaging on behalf of budget, because we didn't want there to be any type of confusion between what we were putting out in traditional comms and for digital, because we knew people were paying attention. So that harmony was really important.
All right, and then a few fun questions on my end. I think they're fun, but my definition of fun is questionable. Is for which one office where you have never worked would you have enjoyed working?
I'm jealous of Matt for getting to the White House. What congressional staffer wouldn't be?
There's still time.
I would love to work for NASA, just awesome pictures and everything. I guess that's not non-congressional answers, so sorry.
I would love to work for national parks. I think the type of things that they're doing and the way they're communicating, you've seen replicated among other federal agencies and also at the state and local level. But I just think the storytelling that's the part that they do so well. So yeah, national parks.
Well, other than Speaker Eric Cantor, which would have been great. Renaissance of digital, by the way, would have been great. I've never worked on the official side in the Senate. So I've done some campaign things on the Senate side, but I've never been on the official side in the upper chamber. So that would be interesting. I don't know if that's in the cards, but it would have been fun.
Huzzah, no one's getting fired. Great answers. Is there a ideal approval chain? And if so, what would it be?
I would say an approval chain that as much as it feels more conversational, the opportunity again, and that's why it's so important for digital staff to build that rapport from the very beginning with their legislative folks, with their comms director, if they have a comms director, whoever it might be, but an opportunity to kind of walk through why the content has been drafted the way it is. Because oftentimes, if you're a digital staffer who, again, is focused on engagement, you really put a lot of thought into what your comms director, your chief might dismiss as just a few characters. So I think having that conversation or making it more conversational as much as possible. But inevitably, that doesn't happen. There will be 7 people who have to approve. There will be a lot of back and forth. you will have to remind folks that tweets cannot be 300 characters yet, and abbreviating every single word does not make sense. No one understands. But yeah, just again, I think that's why the relationship building at the very beginning is so important.
The work best for me was when you had a comms director who was there long enough that had full authority. That's it. I felt like 3/4 of at least social could be approved easily just by that one person. And that one person would know when, okay, this is actually a controversial topic, let's bump this up to the chief for a quick look. Or if it's a very complicated policy issue, let's get a sign off from the policy staffer. But those are more small subsets. So I think you always need one person just to review it for you quickly, and that's usually your comms director. And they should hopefully have authority to authorize.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. But in the question of ideal, for me is 0, which is like literally it's the person, and it's very rarely possible or wise to make it 0. But like the analogy that I've used in the past when making this case is if you go on a radio show, or if you sit down and do a televised interview, or you just talk to a reporter in the hallway as the press secretary, like there's no approval chain. Like you are trusted and empowered to have those engagements. And if you mess up, like, there are consequences for you, but otherwise, like you've been professionally developed so you could do that. And so digital should, in my view, be no different. Again, I get why that's not always possible. And the other way to achieve 0 is to have it be the member themselves, which obviously I think makes a lot of sense when it's the right personality.
Is there a way to make clips easier or less painful?
No.
There's some private sector services that do it for you at a cost, but problem is often member, want them just a certain way, and that's a tough task at 16.
Some people like waking up early, so there's opportunity for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's some members are just going to want to hold, even if they don't read, they do. But in the off chance they don't, it's understanding like what's the goal of this practice, this exercise. And again, like in my past offices, for example, that was a great opportunity, combining clips with social media suggestions at the beginning of the day. So because the biggest thing that one of my former bosses really wanted was to be ahead of something. If he was finding out after the fact, no good. So it was also understanding how can we combine this daily practice in a way that's effective. Not just that he's getting kind of the highlights, but also we're using this as a moment to get ahead for social for the day and start mapping out what our plan is going to be. So, but it's still always going to be painful. As Steve said, there are tools to make it less so, but and it can be calming, have a cup of coffee at 5:30 a.m. Just really.
I mean, it's the kind of activity I really enjoy. So someone's going to start sending me their clips, I'm sure.
We're not cutting them out of a paper and gluing them anymore, hopefully. So that at least is an improvement. So who knows how it'll evolve next? Maybe it'll just be text messages. We can dream, but yeah.
And then a lot of offices don't have a large budget, particularly for digital. So if you have to give someone advice about like, you can't do everything, what is the first thing you tell them? Don't do it. You don't have the capacity to do it. Don't try to do it. What's the first thing to go?
My go-to has always been paper mail, snail mail. It's still important for some segments of the population, but it's just so expensive compared to other alternative ways to get your message out.
I don't know. I mean, coming from a committee, I suppose, and then a member office, I feel like it's all vital. But I think it's also just speaks to the resources-wise, it's really just knowing your member and where their interest actually is. Like if your member is really focused on video, which more and more of them are, it's being realistic about what can we actually do with the equipment we have and the budget we have, and your own capacity of here's how we can make this investment. So yeah, I think they're always going to want to do it all no matter the budget. So.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially if there's any appropriators in here. There's no waste at all. But no, in all seriousness, I think that the place that I look to first are things that can be, you can team up. Because when I worked in a rank and file office or a personal office for a period of years, and we would constantly hit that reality of just the budget of the office. And you're like, okay, well, who can we team up with and kind of pass the hat?
Well, it turns out I'm not the only one who's allowed to ask questions, and so we're supposed to ask the audience for questions. So if anyone has questions for our panel, raise your hand and a mic will be brought. All right.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm Jennifer Victor, the former Kluge Fellow and Professor of Political Science at George Mason University. So I'm particularly interested in the way that members use social media to make connections with one another and develop relationships among themselves. And increasingly struck by the decentralization or fragmentation of social media as the Muskification of Twitter happens, and we have all of these new platforms developing now, and I know there's a lot of kind of uncertainty in the space. So, you know, put on your prediction hat. Like, how do you think the fragmentation of the social media space affects the either ability or challenges for members to use media to make connections among themselves?
I mean, I think it definitely is hurting because most of that happened in Twitter, like the member-to-member stuff, because a lot more Facebook accounts are more staff-driven than Twitter traditionally. And I think I would see it all the time. Like members really did, DM each other in Twitter like a lot, and they'd see each other's posts, which would lead to a lot of fun little feuds or whatever, and sometimes messy ones, but usually fun. And yeah, if there's more breaking apart, and then that would be an unfortunate result that we won't see as much of it. But a lot of accounts aren't even member driven, so a lot of it's still in person on the floor. But
yeah, and I think it's also recognizing which platforms maybe are not a good fit. So, for example, when I was on budget, we started an Instagram account, which now seems kind of silly to say we started an Instagram, but we decided to be more active on Instagram, specifically with Reels, because that is the direct feedback that we had gotten, is this is how you're going to grow. And very quickly realized we were growing because we were getting a lot of really vitriolic responses. And that was fueling the algorithm where that was all we were getting. So yes, our video got 20,000 some odd views, but it was all people with incredibly terrible things to say, which is not fun to read at 5 o'clock in the morning. And the response that we got at the time from the platform was, oh, well, sorry. So we had to pivot. So I mean, it's hard to predict. We don't know, right, what's going to happen. Like, I mean, I know there's been tough decisions even made in offices about, do we get verified on Twitter? What message is that sending? Especially now it looks like we're buying our profile versus being, authentic. Are we endorsing somebody who we might not align with? So all of those decisions are having to be made in the moment with the best knowledge they have at the time. But it's just incredible the amount of now thought that is going to these tiny little details, the greater message it sends depending on which platform they're active on and the decisions they're making there.
Yeah, I don't know if I think we're entering an era of fragmentation very clearly, and that trend will likely continue for a period of years, but I think ultimately consolidation will occur just because of the economics involved with at least amongst the American people, and then Congress will follow suit accordingly. Congress is often, with exceptions at the member level, Congress is often a lagging indicator of where the American people are communicating, rather than a leading indicator. So, if the American people leave a platform to go to another place, like eventually the members will follow. In terms of member-to-member communication, that's always been changing, the digital version of that. I mean, BBM on the BlackBerry was like everything. And members were just like, and then that went away and they figured something else out. So I find that overwhelmingly members are incredibly social, as you know, like just officials, and they love connecting with their colleagues, and so life will find a way on that.
And I think to your point too, like members also see the impact when they do band together to create content, right? So I'm thinking of the video of Senator Booker with Senator Tester that they made, I think it was last year, out on, like, again, super short video, but the impact that it had just by the fact that they collaborated again was, Yeah,
and I think he just dropped one with,
I missed it.
earlier this week with Gillibrand.
Love it. Yeah, their office is really good about that, yeah.
Yep. Oh, wait. Up front.
Thank you. So, I know you hit on this a little bit earlier about sort of what we should be looking to and what we should kind of be seeing as a measure of success here. But when a lot of members are very kind of numbers based and kind of want to see proof or the metrics, the analytics, what are the sorts of things that we should be prioritizing if we are trying to make the point that virality isn't always the thing we should be chasing? Is there a certain metric or is there a certain way of thinking about it and ingesting the data that does better weight what we should be prioritizing here with these platforms?
I can take this first. So I think to your point earlier about engagement. So one thing that I did in both of my offices at the very beginning was to level set of here's what our average is, because that gave a much more realistic picture of like, this is what we're aiming to be more than. We're hoping to increase it. Because as you said, if you have somebody whose only goal is to go viral, or they see a video of a colleague and it has, again, 200,000 views, you're setting yourself up to fail as a digital person because you can't guarantee you're going to get 200,000 views. And so it's really level setting about what is your goal here, how can we be most effective, what are things that we've done that you've found to be effective, and then again going to them with the numbers, and even in providing that context every week of like, here's the context for why I think this performed well or why I don't think it did. Again, keeping it more conversational, but it's an opportunity to show your expertise as a digital staffer, just to level set from the very beginning to provide that big picture understanding.
I had the pleasure of running the social media contest for every summer for House Democrats for a number of years, and where all the members would sort of race to get new followers and traction on all the different social sites, and we'd have big trophies for the members. It was a lot of fun. But of course, we were tracking all the analytics. We were trying to score. We literally had a scoreboard of racing donkeys. But I think it's true on both sides. It's pretty easy to be, really go viral when you're on the political edges. When you're on it's a lot harder to do towards the middle and in a sort of positive, sort of constructive.
On the budget committee, maybe?
Yes.
We made the budget exciting, okay? The budget has never been more exciting.
So, and of course, most members of Congress are, generally more towards the middle, and arguable, but that's just really hard to communicate and to get good traction and to get to people reading your information, because that's the whole point. So I think you just got to collect the analytics and you just got to be creative. You got to go where the people are. You got to partner with other organizations. I remember one year, because they, in the middle of the contest, dropped a animal rights bill, and they partnered with, PETA, and all the others were suddenly retweeting and everything, and so it was just the power of outside groups. So, yeah.
And I'm even thinking of the new freshman congressman from North Carolina, and the videos he's put out. Again, probably something that's been tried and true from other members, but it was about the little touches he did, the way he sat, the way it's lit, the way he's speaking, just again, he's speaking very much to more of a middle, and that's how he was able to have those viral moments. He wasn't trying to replicate the strategy of somebody else, but he really focused on here's the bread and butter of how I want to communicate, and that has worked very, very well for him.
I love those videos.
Yeah, they're so nice. They're so soothing.
Other questions? Right there.
Hi, you talked a little bit about the cost side, but what about the value side? In other words, as we moved from newspapers to television to social media, is the electorate better informed? Do they better understand policy trade-offs? Are they better engaged? Do they have more quality discussions with each other? In other words, do we have a stronger democracy because of your efforts in social media?
I think on a relative basis, yes. On an absolute basis, no. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think because of the efforts of people like to my left and others, there has been progress made. And I think it's important to recognize that, because if one doesn't believe in that progress can be achieved, then people stop trying to achieve it. And so I've just seen it firsthand whether it's a communications initiative or a policy initiative, like it's helped make something possible and improved policy outcomes. On an absolute basis, I think that despite the immediacy of the availability of that information, particularly just the collapse of the municipal newspaper market, where you used to have 2 papers in each market, each major city in the country, now you have 0 on average, or maybe 1. that's completely dependent on the wire services. I saw the very tail end of that, and where you had 2 beat reporters from a local paper who were obsessed with the delegation. And I know that many entrepreneurs and journalists and others have struggled with how to replicate that in the economics of the digital world, but so far no one's really broken through. And then the second is the fragmentation of the information sources itself, which goes back before digital, as you know, getting into the rise of cable and other things, but we've lost the ability to have like a central place where there is this is the information. And even when that information is wrong, at least it's a place everyone can react to in the same way. So on balance, I think digital has tremendous potential to create a stronger democracy than has ever been achieved in the history of civilization, not to be too over the top, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think some of that is maybe better answered for academics, if you want to jump.
Oh, yeah, feel free.
Good point.
I'll say something after.
But I mean, I just remember 20 years ago when I first started on the Hill, and there was 0 social media. I mean, for us to get our message out to constituents was just press releases. I mean, that was it. That and talking to reporters to influence articles. And so, I mean, nowadays, you got press shops, that are pumping out so many posts and tweets and, on 10, 20 different topics. We used to only send a press release or 2 a day 20 years ago. I mean, and we would spend a whole bunch of time on those couple press releases. But now it's just like rapid fire, but it's all very informative. And I would also say it's overwhelmingly positive. I mean, I know the negative gets a lot of attention and the worst stuff. And of course, there's plenty of bad stuff out there. And it does feel like lately the sites are just less constructive. But if you look at just actual members of Congress getting their message out, more to your question, I think for the most part, the communications are very positive and constructive. And so if I'm a member of the public and I want to actually engage with my member, I got way more opportunity to do so than I did 20 years ago before social media. I can just start following them. I can see what their office spends, hour by hour doing and working on. And I think that's good for democracy. Obviously downsides as well. But.
Yeah, to date myself a little bit. So I actually started my career off the Hill at nonprofits, and I remember I was working at a large international nonprofit at the time, nature conservation nonprofit, and I remember doing analysis of well, why are our Facebook posts, what are the ones that are doing well? And I remember thinking that I was really onto something when I went to my boss and said, it's the ones that really make people angry. Anger seems to be the thing where when we say something kind of saucy, they really respond. And I thought I was really onto something. And now in retrospect, of course, that wasn't that great of an insight, but it also was speaking to, even at that point, our very elementary understandings of the algorithms and how information is delivered. And I think that's always going to be something that no matter what platform is created is always going to be the fundamental struggle, because that's, at the end of the day, the echo chambers we're creating. And to your point about are we creating more divisions? That is the fundamental question. By delivering people the things that they engage with, how is that benefiting democracy? And that's just, I know I do not have the answer to that. Something I'm always trying to better understand, because at the end of the day, our goal should be in public service to be delivering things to the American people that make their lives better. And is digital the way we're doing that? I think that remains to be seen. I feel yeah, all of the scholars in 10 or 20 years will very easily be able to say, I don't know right now. I truly don't know.
Yeah, no, I following up on sort of the algorithm and echo chamber, it's a little bit dated, but if you looked at everything the Senate set out on Twitter in 2013 and 2015, yes, I read all of it. Even if you look at how much of that was about policy, right, things that we would think about legislation, that's 2/3 of it, right? And then you've got constituent stuff and holidays, but only 10 or 12% of that was sort of what we think of as politics or partisan politics, or sort of that negativity that we see perpetuated. So it's not necessarily that they themselves are just living in this negative space, right? But you think about the algorithm, you think about how things populate, you think about what does well, and then you have to think about the incentives of the platform itself. I think we have time for one more question in the middle, right here in the black.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. This was really fascinating. I wanted to follow up. I think Sam mentioned this, but you're talking about how important authenticity is in digital communications. And obviously, Congress skews a little bit older. So I think a lot of us struggle, with our bosses. They wouldn't, out of their own volition, maybe be on Instagram Reels. So sort of how do you reconcile staying authentic to whoever you're working for and also getting your digital communications out there and experimenting with new platforms like Twitch or like Reddit, AMAs, but still kind of staying true to maybe a middle-aged man.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, I previously worked for somebody who would filming a video, they would only want to film the video maybe in their office or away from, they were very, very mindful, understandably, about at constituent events or at community events that focuses on the community, to the point where we would hang back because he did not want to have staff all around him. His goal was to be approachable. And so I had to think about that and how I approached him to pitch digital content. So for example, he's not going to want to film a video right after he comes out of a constituent event, right, where people are walking by, because his goal is to be there. Like if he's present with them, then he wants to be present, and me filming immediately puts that guard up between them. So I had to think about, okay, do we pre-film in his office ahead of time? Or is there a quiet space that we can step over where he doesn't feel like people are watching him, and he's able to deliver the message that he wants to deliver? So, ultimately, you have grand visions of like the type of video you want, right? Like we were at an event that was on the beach, and I'm like, if he gets in the waves, that would be pretty cool, but I'm not gonna ask this person who's older to be like, get in the water. So it's like, okay, so like for me, and I know I'm getting now into the nuts and bolts of like strategy, but like, okay, so I'm gonna get a lot of B-roll, and I'm gonna rely more on voiceover, because we can film that later, and I'm gonna put that over that. And there, again, I'm not getting in the middle of his interactions with constituents, but I'm also getting the type of content he wants. So I think you just find that with time as you build that relationship, and that's why relationship building with your member is so, so important, so they trust you. So when you do approach them about a new platform, they're like, yeah, they know what I want, they understand my voice, they understand my concerns, and building that trust is so important, no matter which member you work for, even when you ask them to get in the water. He actually did, but I didn't have to ask him to do it. It was releasing sea turtles, and he did it on his own, and it was great. It was a great video.
It's authentic.
It was very authentic. The sea turtles made it. One slapped him. It was great. Yeah, not great at slapped him, but it was a good video.
Yeah, I would just say like it's kind of the digital staff's job. Like members of Congress are experts in a whole lot of different things. Not many of them are experts in digital comms. AOC certainly is, and some others, but and so therefore it's digital staffers' job to know their voice, to know to make them feel and look authentic when they're on a platform that they may not even really know much about, and then to educate the member, of course, about that platform so that they know where they are.
Yeah, I think those are both really good points. And the only thing I would add is like each member of Congress was elected to Congress for like at least a reason. And if you can understand that reason, you can understand a lot about them as a leader and as a representative. And so whether it's the people that I've worked for or just being asked advice for other members on occasion, I try to understand that. And then use that as the lens with which I apply like their authenticity to a given platform's like particular tactics or strategies. Because like for some members it might be that they're the life of the party, or they're this young, dynamic, energetic leader. In others it says they're just very thoughtful, deliberative, and they take care of all the little details, and so on. And so, not trying to, I think sometimes as staffers we can try to project, because we see it work for other members or we see it work outside the Hill, and we're like, oh, well, I want to try that for my boss. And if it's not true to that thesis, then I would actually recommend not doing it. It's better to just find something that works for your boss. And we've all seen these cases, like at least over the last 10 plus years, where there's a member who you would never think would ever have any kind of viral energy or like digital savvy, and they don't do it with the way you would expect. It's like them sitting at a desk just like talking about something, and it gets like 2 million views. But because it's authentic.
Do we have time for one more, actually? Okay. a quick one.
Oh gosh, I had such a broad question. No, I'll try to be quick with it. So you've been very, I feel, optimistic in ways about like the power of digital communication, and it's been alluded to a little bit, but I wanted to draw out this notion of what happens when the platform itself becomes part of like the political contest, like has kind of happened with Twitter, at least since 2020. Like, what do you do as digital staff when the platform itself is such like a contested venue?
So those are decisions that other members have already, I know at least that I can recall one member who's already is not on a platform anymore because for that reason, where they said this isn't the type of engagement I want to have. I'm not actually reaching constituents, and they haven't been on the platform, I think, for 2 or 3 years. And so, again, as a digital staffer, it's seeing that big picture, understanding that larger trend, and being willing to go to your boss and explain, like, here's what's going on. A previous boss I had, his big focus was that if something was going wrong or a mistake was made, he wanted to know first. That was all he ever asked. And so if you're seeing, or now as we see these platforms that are becoming more fractured, that are potentially becoming, I don't want to use the word dangerous, but questionable, it's being very upfront with your boss about here's what I'm seeing and opening up the conversation, potentially, obviously speaking, of course, first to your comms director and to your, your chief. But that is the onus on digital staff. It's not just writing your daily tweets. It's not just making videos. It's seeing the big picture and seeing where things are maybe going awry and tough decisions that need to be made in order to protect the integrity of your boss.
Yeah, and it's not just Twitter right now. I mean, like, it happened with Facebook a lot, 4 or 5 years ago. And a lot of members were very upset with Facebook. When I was running the contest, I got a lot of heat, for, how are we having any affiliation with this company after what just happened and all this stuff. And, TikTok, there's lots of big, major policy question marks surrounding TikTok, yet it's like the hottest, place with the most people. So, I mean, as a digital strategist, I would make the argument we need to, get past those policy problems, communicate them, but we have to go where the people are. And that would be my point. And if enough people make that decision, then of course you can go to the other platforms. But it's a tough call for members of Congress right now.
All right, well, I think that's all we have for discussion, but I wanted to thank you all again for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
3 things. Please join us for a reception and continue the conversation. We value your feedback, so do drop off your surveys at the back. And please join me again for this, for thanking this amazing panel.